In the previous episode of this manhua, we saw how the main character Han Fong had to prepare before that very day. He needed to stock up on enough food supplies, but he couldn't let his neighbors suspect his sudden hoarding. So, Han Fong had his packages sealed in hazardous boxes, and sensitive supplies like medical equipment were moved by Han Fong at night when no one was around. With those issues sorted, the next problem was electricity. After the apocalypse hit, the power grid would be extremely unstable, so Han Fong got a generator and enough fuel to keep it running for at least a year. Also, the heating system would stop when the apocalypse hit, so Han Fong modified his house for independent heating and reinforced his doors and windows while he was at it. He even dedicated an entire room for storing his supplies. By the time he finished getting everything ready, it was already July 14, and the beginning of the apocalypse was the very next day. Han Fong knew that to survive in the upcoming Ice Age apocalypse, relying solely on the supplies he'd accumulated wouldn't be enough. He needed a long-term solution, and the key was to find out more about his power to manipulate plants. After all, it was his last hope. Han Fong had cooked the soybeans he grew and decided to eat them to check if they were edible. Staring nervously at his spoon full of cooked soybeans, Han Fong hesitated, and rightfully so. He had no clue what to expect if he ate it, but Han Fong knew that if he didn't try, he would never know. With his ability acting so randomly, it was difficult to figure out its triggers. So as he took a deep breath, Han Fong took a bite. To his surprise, it was edible. Not only that, it also tasted just like any normal soybean. In fact, it was so delicious that Han Fong finished half his plate before he even realized it. After confirming that he could now produce food, the next step, Han Fong thought, was to figure out how this ability of his actually worked. So far, he'd only tried it on soybeans. Han Fong opened his fridge, which was now fully stocked with all kinds of food. He decided to test if his ability also worked on other plants. Hours passed just like that, and before he even realized it, the sun had already set. Han Fong found it difficult to open his eyes, and when he eventually did, he questioned if he had passed out. He was also holding a fresh vegetable in his hand. Han Fong's head was spinning, and he felt extremely exhausted. It seemed this power took a serious toll on his mind and body. So, to replenish his lost energy, Han Fong decided to finish his plate. As he was eating, so far, he had learned something new about his ability. As he continued to stare at his right hand, he recollected his progress. Before Han Fong had blacked out earlier, he had tried using his power on a bunch of different plants. Some vegetables didn't react at all. Some grew from seeds to fully grown plants, just like the soybean seeds. And some, well, they just exploded in Han Fong's face. But the weirdest aspect of it was that after the explosion, they turned into a coal-like substance that was extremely light. Seeing this, Han Fong decided to try heating it, and voila! He found out that it could be used as regular coal, which made Han Fong extremely pleased with himself. This meant he wouldn't have to worry about staying warm forever. Afterward, he tried many more times, but the success rate was extremely low. However, Han Fong started to notice a pattern. When he remained calm and focused, there was some reaction. So, he tried to remain calm and focused when activating his ability, and to his surprise, a fresh broccoli grew instantly in his hand. This was when Han Fong passed out immediately after. Back to the present, Han Fong was contemplating. He couldn't find any significant patterns at all, but he knew deep within him, like a gut feeling, that there was definitely some kind of principle behind how his ability worked. Han Fong placed the fresh broccoli on his table and sat in the lotus position, trying to meditate. He imagined himself out in nature, standing naked, making his mind and body a part of nature. As Han Fong slowly opened his eyes, he was delighted to see that it was a success. Ability was directly connected to his consciousness. Then, he decided to use it on some fresh, juicy meat. Han Fong picked out a fresh, juicy piece of meat with his glowing green hand, expecting it to grow. There was no reaction. He tried meditating while holding it again. Nothing happened. Then, he remembered. When he was meditating, he could sense two distinct colors, and he hadn't even tried using the red color yet. This prompted him to once again close his eyes and try to summon the red light. Several minutes passed, but nothing happened. Then, finally, after what seemed like forever, the red light activated and started covering the whole piece of meat. Han Fong opened his eyes moments later when he smelled something odd. Immediately upon opening his eyes, he was disgusted. The meat looked spoiled, to the extent that just the smell was enough to make him want to puke. He threw the meat on the floor, but after a while, curiosity got the best of him, and he came back to check what the meat had really turned into. Han Fong was a little disappointed. Upon close inspection, the meat actually looked like it had been cooked, or was close to being rotten or something. Seeing this, Han Fong thought to himself, is this all the red light could do? Heat things up like this? No, there has to be more. The meat looked like it had gone through a disintegration process. The word disintegration sparked an idea in Han Fang's head, so he immediately grabbed some soybeans in his right hand, then activated his green light. In his left hand, he held the meat covered in the red light. Han Fang thought, if my guess is correct, then the green light represents the evolution of matter, and the red light represents the opposite, which is disintegration. So what if I combine them? Hey, quick fact, 97% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying the content, hit that subscribe button. It's free, helps the channel grow, and keeps you in the loop. Thanks for your support. As soon as he did, Han Fang exclaimed in surprise, his eyes bulging out like they were about to fall off. The small, low-quality meat grew almost 5 times its size and turned into premium-looking meat. Dumbfounded, Han Fang was confused about what had just happened. He had casually merged both lights, not knowing the result would be like this. Also, the soybean in his left hand was gone. Did it merge with the meat? Han Fang checked the meat up close, smelling and tasting it, but the meat looked, felt, and smelled exactly like real meat. It was even somehow fresher, like premium meat. Beaming with excitement, Han Fang decided to try this one more time, but he ended up ruining all the meat, which made him beat the floor over and over again in frustration. Having had enough, Han Fang thought he would just have to figure it out later. He stared at his glowing hands and thought his day had been really productive since he had figured out a bit about his abilities. He knew that if he mastered his power, he could become the only man standing at the pinnacle of the imminent apocalyptic world. But just as he was daydreaming, another thought came to mind that froze him on the spot. Han Fang had forgotten about weapons. He immediately packed all the food back into a box. But in the middle of his packing, it started to snow outside. It's here, Han Fang thought. It was finally happening. The apocalypse had started. It was really happening. After that, Han Fang, now wearing warm clothes, was walking down the streets, deep in thought. In just a few hours, the entire street was being covered with snow. Han Fang knew the temperature would drop below -45°C within the week. However, Han Fang wasn't bothered about such matters. He needed a gun, and although buying a gun was illegal, Han Fang couldn't even buy one if he tried. He didn't have any connections to get one. Just then, a sharp voice pierced Han Fang's ears. The source of the voice belonged to a young man with an exaggerated fashion style, acting all high and mighty with no actual work to do. He was always roaming the streets aimlessly. Everyone knew him as Homeless Joe, but his real name was Lee, and the people around him called him Brother Lee. Lee lived in the same neighborhood as Han Fang. Lee was reputed to be in charge of big construction projects and seemed to know everyone around. But the truth was, he didn't have a proper job. He always claimed to be busy. The only thing he had was some connections with big shots and even gangsters. And that was the only reason Han Fang thought of him. He was the only man Han Fang knew who could get guns for him. So, with a nervous look, Han Fang called his name, waving as he did so. But when Lee turned his head to look at Han Fang, his face was filled with annoyance, like he had been interrupted in a huge business meeting. He asked if he knew Han Fang. Han Fang explained that they had met a while ago and lived in the same neighborhood. Lee, acting bored, said he was pretty busy, so Han Fang shouldn't blame him for his bad memory. Anyway, what can I do for you? Lee asked. Han Fang immediately looked from side to side and, after confirming that there was no one around, came close to Lee and whispered in his ear, asking if he had ever dealt with guns. This shocked Lee greatly, so he asked why Han Fang needed a gun. Han Fang remained silent for a while, feeling uncertain. Guilty at seeing Han Fang's silence, Lee assumed Han Fang was planning something illegal with the gun. He warned him not to try any funny business, saying, "Guns are dangerous, and although I've got connections, I'm not going to help you get entangled with anything risky." But on the spot, Han Fang came up with an excuse. He explained it wasn't what Lee was thinking. He only needed the gun for self-defense. A flashback shows a day not long ago when Han Fang was riding his bike to work and ran into an old man who was spitting everywhere. The man spat right on Han Fang's face. Han Fang confronted him, insisting he apologize, but the man spat on his face again. Furious, Han Fang gave him a good beating. As the old man left, he said he'd get back at Han Fang, and sure enough, the very next day, the same old man came back with his gang and attacked Han Fang. Still, to this day, whenever they saw Han Fang, a beating would soon follow. His life had become a living hell. He had never been so humiliated. That's why he needed the gun for self-defense. Seeing Lee getting all worked up and angry surprised Han Fang. He didn't expect this cliché story to work, let alone to this degree. Lee grabbed Han Fang by the shoulder and told him, "Say no more. From this moment onwards, your big brother Lee's got you covered. Lee proceeded to tell Han Fong that he would make sure to fulfill his request. Now, Han Fong just needed to follow him to the bus stop so they could hop on. Lee told Han Fong that his Mercedes was in service, so they would need to make do with the bus. Han Fong expected this, so he wasn't surprised. Although Lee was a big talker and liked to bluff, he wasn't a bad person. Han Fong then took out the keys to his SUV, telling Lee not to worry about it. He had a car. Seeing this, Lee couldn't help but be surprised. Soon after, the two were in the SUV, and as Han Fong was driving, Lee was really impressed. He didn't think Han Fong was rich. Lee immediately took out his phone and started taking pictures, posting them on social media, boasting about driving his new car. Finally, after a while, they reached their destination. From the looks of it, people on the streets were already feeling the cold, making fires to warm themselves. As soon as Lee got out of the SUV, everyone around him came close, surprised and shocked, asking what business he had there. And what's with this SUV? How much was it? Hearing this, Lee casually said, it's nothing much, just 700 grand, give or take. Meanwhile, Han Fong was speechless. He thought it was bold for Lee to claim ownership of the car right in front of the actual owner. As they went inside, the boss, who was leisurely sitting on his sofa, asked Lee what he was doing there at a time like this. Lee, a little nervous, first offered Boss Lu a cigarette, then introduced Han Fong, saying he wanted to buy a gun. Hearing this, Boss Lu took a quick look at Han Fong, sending chills down his spine. That's it? A lousy gun? I thought you were bringing me something interesting, Boss Lu said with a smirk. He then told one of his men, Shang, to give Han Fong a handgun. The price is 6 grand, Boss Lu said nonchalantly. Hearing the mention of a handgun, Han Fong, still nervous, asked, is it possible to get something a little longer? You know, like one with a scope? Hearing this, Boss Lu paused, staring at Han Fong, who began to sweat bullets. Then a loud roar echoed through the entire room. Kid, are you asking for a freaking sniper rifle? Do you think this is a shopping mall where you can just order anything you want? Take the damn handgun or leave it. Lee, seeing the boss so worked up, immediately jumped to Han Fong's side, spinning a tragic tale to justify his request. You don't know this, boss, Lee started, but Han Fong's had a rough life. His ex-wife, she had 3 kids, and none of them were his. As the story unfolded, Boss Lu's eyes widened with every detail. By the time Lee finished, the boss was livid, slamming his hand down on his desk. What kind of vile woman does that to a man? He roared. The sudden outburst startled Han Fong, who could barely believe what was happening. Somehow, Lee's completely fabricated story had worked wonders. Boss Lu, now fully invested in Han Fong's made-up misery, had a change of heart. You know what? I'll get you that sniper rifle, he declared. Han Fong was speechless, realizing how ridiculous the situation was. His obvious fake stories had somehow convinced them both. Thank you, Boss Lu, Han Fong said, genuinely surprised by how things had turned out. Boss Lu waved his hand dismissively and instructed Shang to check if they had a semi-automatic rifle in stock for Han Fong. As an unexpected gesture of generosity, he also gave Han Fong a loaded handgun as a gift. This act of kindness stunned Han Fong, who was still on edge but grateful. Feeling the need to share more vital information, Han Fong mentioned, I've got a friend who works for the government. He told me there's going to be a major food shortage soon, due to the unusual weather. It might be smart to stock up while things are still available. Boss Lu looked skeptical at first, but Han Fong's serious demeanor made him reconsider. All right, Boss Lu said, nodding, I'll think about it. Now get out of here. Seeing Lee's face is annoying me. Once outside, Lee couldn't help but start bragging. See how I handled that? Beautifully, right? If it wasn't for me, you'd be done for. I bet if I'd asked Boss Lu for a cannon, he would have given it to us. Han Fong smiled and thanked Lee. As a token of gratitude, he promised to grab him some cigarettes on their way back. Don't be silly, Lee replied, pretending to be humble. I don't need cigarettes. I just like helping people out. But if you insist, I like the Hui brand. The other ones make me choke. And hey, once I get paid for my next project, I'll pay you back and take you to a nice sauna. Han Fong tuned out Lee's bragging and empty promises as his mind wandered. With weapons and supplies secured, he felt somewhat ready for the early stages of the impending apocalypse. All that was left was to refine his ability, which would be key to his survival. If he could fully master it, his chances of thriving would skyrocket. Just as Han Fang was lost in thought, his foot slipped on the icy ground. Before he knew it, he did an awkward backward flip, his shoe flying off in the process, and landed hard on the ground, groaning in pain. Holding his foot, he realized it might be broken. Trembling from the pain, Han Fang handed his SUV keys to Li. "Take me to the hospital," he pleaded. But Li, nervous, replied, "I don't have a driver's license. I can't drive." Frustrated, Han Fang could barely speak. Li, panicking, tried to lift Han Fang onto his shoulder but struggled, looking like he had just eaten raw peppers and was about to pass out himself. Han Fang, still in pain, was utterly speechless at the absurdity of the situation. Snowstorm outside worsened by the minute. It was freezing, and the whole town was enveloped in heavy snow. By the time they reached the hospital, the walls were covered in ice, and inside, the nurses were anxiously watching the deteriorating weather. As the emergency phone rang, one of the night shift nurses, whose figure rivaled that of a model, hurried to the hallway to respond to a call. In the other wing of the hospital, Han Fang lay in a bed, groaning in pain. The X-ray confirmed his fears. His leg was indeed broken. After a close examination, the physician diagnosed a stable fracture on Han Fang's right tibia, ensuring he'd be out of commission for quite some time.